Okay, so first we're going to discuss why the demand curve shifts in the first place. And it's important to remember what the demand curve represents. And we've discussed how the demand curve represents the willingness to pay of consumers in a given market. And just sort of to refresh your memory, as we go up and down any given demand curve, these folks up here in the upper left-hand portion, they have high willingness to pay, and these folks down here in the lower portion of the demand curve, they have low willingness to pay. So the demand curve really is a representation of that idea of willingness to pay for a particular good. Now, if the demand curve were to increase, what you want to think about this is that the market demand for a given good is increasing. And what this means is that the willingness to pay for the good is also increasing at any given quantity. Again, when we say demand increases, we're shifting the entire curve. So when we shift the entire curve, we can see that at any given quantity, here's the equilibrium at the initial curve. If I take the same quantity and I go up to the new higher demand curve, I see that I would in fact be willing to pay more for the same quantity. So think about this for a moment. If I'm suggesting that at a given quantity, I now am willing to pay more for a particular good, this must mean that I want the good more, or that I'm demanding the good more. Now, this can happen for any number of reasons, and we'll discuss why here in just a second. But again, it's important for us to remember that when we're talking about demand increasing, what we mean is that for whatever reason, consumers in the market now want the good more. They literally are willing to pay more for the same amount of good as they were previously. And in many cases, we see that they actually buy more of the good as a result. So let's talk about what will actually shift the demand curve. We have four basic reasons why the demand curve will shift. The demand curve can shift because of consumer tastes, the price of a substitute good, price of a complement good, or the expected price of a good. Now, we can probably come up with more reasons, but a lot of them can be filtered down into one of these four categories. When we say consumer taste, we simply mean how much do consumers enjoy the good. A really good example of a good that's seen its consumer taste rise over time is quinoa. 15 years ago, I had never heard of the good quinoa. It was really nowhere to be found. I'm sure you had some fringe health food nuts that really were probably all over quinoa back in the late 90s, early 2000s. But it was really something that we saw come on the market around 2008, 2009, and now it's sort of everywhere. But you can think about the fact that before people knew what quinoa was, they certainly couldn't demand it. But then as people started to realize all its different uses and its health aspects, the consumers now developed more of a taste for it. And so what we can think about this as an increase in demand. So we can say that the market demand for quinoa rose over time. And what this means is that more quinoa is purchased and the price of quinoa rises. Now, if we think about the price of a substitute good, so a really good example here is, let's think about Coke versus Pepsi. So if we're talking about the market for, say, Coke, and we think about the price of a substitute Pepsi rising, then this would mean that people will buy less Pepsi and buy more Coke. Substitute goods simply mean that I'm willing to substitute away from a good for another good. So Coke and Pepsi, you can think about even steak and chicken, blue cars, red cars. So it's just something that you would buy either or of, but you wouldn't buy together. So you wouldn't normally buy both Coke and Pepsi. You would buy one or the other. And so when we think about the price of a substitute going up, this would mean that we would demand more of a good. So if the price of Pepsi rises, we demand more Coke. And so the demand curve would shift out and to the right. A price of a complement good. So this would be a good that you bought normally at the same time. The classic example of complement goods are peanut butter and jelly. So if the price of jelly were to fall, so let's say jelly got cheaper, then we would expect people to buy more peanut butter. So we'd in fact expect the market demand for peanut butter to increase if the price of jelly were to fall. Now, a pretty unique example of a demand shifter comes in the form of expected price. Now, this is pretty straightforward when you get a handle for it, but at first it can be a little confusing. So when we say expected price, we mean what will the price of this good be in the future. So, for example, let's say that you're in the market for a laptop and you want to buy a new one, and you're kind of sort of looking at the prices, and you read online that you think that the price of laptops will increase in the future for any particular reason. What this is going to cause you to do is buy the computer now. So if we expect the price of computers to be higher or to rise in the future, then I want to buy that computer now. So we say that if the expected price rises for the good, then demand will increase now. Now, on the opposite side, for demand increases, we can basically think of any of these positive or demand increasing examples and just think about the opposite. So for whatever reason people think less of a good, then we expect the demand for that good to fall over time. So a good example of consumers losing their taste for a good are cigarettes. So people just don't buy cigarettes as much as they used to, largely because of the realization of the health risks, so on and so forth. If the price of a substitute were to fall, so if, in other words, if we're thinking about the market for Coke now, if the price of Pepsi were to fall, then we expect people to demand more Pepsi as a substitute away from Coke. And so we would expect the market demand for Coke, in fact, to fall if the price of Pepsi were to decrease. If the price of a complement good were to rise, so go back to our peanut butter and jelly example, if the price of jelly were to rise, then we would expect people to buy less peanut butter. And again, this is just from our notion of when goods are commonly purchased together. And again, empirically we can see that when the price of a complement rises, we do tend to see consumers buying considerably less of a good. And then lastly, if the expected price. So if I think the expected price of a good is going to be lower in the future for any given reason, then I will decrease my demand for the good now, and I will wait for the price to drop. So a good example of this would be something like a tax-free weekend, or basically where the implicit price of something is going to be lower in a weekend where we decide we're not going to collect sales taxes. We often do this before the school year. And so if I expect the price of school supplies to be lower at some point in the future, I'm not going to purchase the school supplies now. So in fact, the demand for school supplies will fall now, and then later on will increase as the expected price does fall. Now the supply side is a little bit more straightforward, again because the supply side is largely based on the notion of cost. So when we think about supply, it's important to remember that the supply curve represents willingness to accept. So a firm has a particular willingness to accept for the price of their good. And again, this is largely from cost. So how much it costs a producer to produce a good is going to put them onto particular places in the supply curve. So the producers down here in the lower left-hand portion of the supply curve have low cost of production. So that's why they're willing to offer the goods for a cheap price. Those producers that are in the upper right-hand portion of the supply curve, they have high production cost. This is why they are unwilling to offer low prices for their goods. So when we think about what shifts supply, again, what we're thinking about is what would increase producers' willingness to supply their good. And we can sort of think about it again, just like we did with demand. If I pick a particular price, or excuse me, a particular quantity, Q star, and I were to take this up to my original supply curve, I can see that my willingness to accept is P star. If I take the same Q star and I take it up to now my new supply curve, my increased supply, as it shifted from S to S prime, I can see on this new supply curve, producers are willing to offer the good for a much lower price than P star originally. And so what this means is that if supply were to increase, then producers are more willing to offer the good than they were previously. And the reasons why that we might see a supply shift are pretty basic. So technology. If the technology improves for a company, they usually get faster at making their good. And so you can think about if technology improves, this is going to push the supply of that particular good out from S to S prime in this direction. A good example of this is the cotton gin. So prior to the cotton gin, it was a relatively arduous task to pick cotton. And then when the cotton gin was invented, this drastically increased the efficiency of cotton production. And so you saw the shift from S to S prime in terms of cotton. Another reason why the supply may shift is because of cost. And if costs were to decrease, maybe because the supplier that I'm buying a good that I use in my production. So, for example, if I am a computer manufacturer and I need to buy all of my individual components to make my computers, if the suppliers of my goods start selling their goods, what I use for my products, for lower price, then this would constitute a decrease in cost. And if costs are to be decreased, then this will increase my willingness to supply the good, and again we will shift from S to S prime. And then lastly, we also expect expected price to shift the supply curve. In this case, if I believe as a producer that the expected price for my good will fall in the future, this means that I'm going to want to supply as much as my good now to take advantage of the current relatively higher price than it will be in the future. So a really good example, and this comes in the form of computers. So right at the tail end of the 1990s, what we saw was an expectation that the price of computers would fall drastically as both the supply, there were just a lot more companies producing at the time, and the technology was really increasing. So the expected price of computers was expected to fall pretty fast. And what we saw at that time was a drastic increase in the number of computers, and so we definitely saw an increase of supply from S to S prime. Now on the negative supply shift, again, if we shift supply back, we move from S to S prime this direction, so back and to the left. And this would come from the rare occurrence of technology decreasing. Now, we don't often think about technology decreasing, but if, for example, you own a business in a war-torn country, and so post-war you may have access to less technology than you did prior to the war, so we would expect countries that sort of go through war to see supply shifts back into the left. If the cost for your production were to rise, so for example, if the price of oil rose and you used a lot of oil in the production of your goods, say if you're an airline company, or if you're a gas company and you obviously use oil explicitly, if oil increases in cost, then this means that you are now less willing to supply your good than you were previously, and we would expect to shift back into the left. And then maybe pretty straightforward at this point, if the expected price of your good were to rise in the future, then this would mean I'm less willing to supply the good now. I'm going to wait and then offer my good on the market when the price rises. And this would again cause the curve to shift from S to S prime. And as we can see when the supply curve shifts back, we expect less quantity and less price. And as long as you remember that the supply curve shifting is a result of a reduction or an increase in the willingness to accept a particular price, then you should be able to keep this notion of supply curve shifting either out and to the right or back and to the left pretty straight. We will, again, later on in the course, talk about the supply side of the market in much more detail, but for right now it's important that we remember that it's based almost explicitly on cost. And so in that way it becomes a little bit of a simpler notion, a little bit of a simpler concept, and then later on we will complicate it.